I used to believe that if you loved someone deeply enough, loyalty would protect you. I was wrong. Very wrong. When I married Daniel, I didn't marry into wealth, I married into ambition. His family wasn't rich. But they owned something far more dangerous. A growing business and a belief that people were assets, not humans. At first, they welcomed me. My mother-in-law hugged me too tightly and said I was simple and adjustable, like that was a compliment. My father-in-law shook my hand and told me I seemed useful. Useful. I should have noticed that word. Daniel and I met when we were both struggling. He admired my intelligence, my discipline. The way I could turn chaos into structure. I admired his ambition, his confidence. His dreams of building something bigger than himself. When we married, I thought we were partners. What I didn't know was that his parents had already begun evaluating me. Not as a wife, but as a long-term investment. They owned a manufacturing company that had potential but terrible management. Losses were quietly buried, accounts were messy. And contracts were based more on ego than strategy. I had studied business. Not flashy degrees, but real experience. When they asked me to help a little, I did. At first, it was small things. Reviewing invoices. Organizing records. Then negotiations. Supplier restructuring. Cost reduction. Within a year, profits increased. No one thanked me. Instead, expectations grew. I worked late nights without pay. I skipped family events to fix emergencies that weren't mine. When I asked Daniel if this was normal, he smiled and said, "That's how family businesses work." I believed him. Because I wanted to belong. The shift happened quietly. It always does. My mother-in-law started correcting how I spoke in public. My clothes were suddenly too modest. My background was not refined enough. At dinners, I was seated slightly away from important guests. During meetings, my ideas were repeated by others and praised, as if they hadn't come from me. Daniel noticed. But he stayed silent. That silence was louder than any insult. Then came the comments about image. They wanted someone more polished. Someone who looked like money. Someone who made investors feel comfortable. They never said my name when discussing the problem. But I knew. I asked Daniel one night if he still respected me. He hesitated. That hesitation broke something inside me. The real betrayal began when they brought her in. Lillian. She was introduced as a consultant. Educated abroad. Well-dressed. Confident. In a way that comes from knowing. You're already wanted. She smiled at me like someone who had already won. Meetings I used to attend were suddenly private. Documents I had created were locked behind new permissions. When I asked questions, I was told not to worry. "You've done enough," my mother-in-law said gently. Enough. As if I were a phase. As if my usefulness had expired. Daniel grew distant. Not cruel, worse. Indifferent. When I confronted him, he said his parents were under pressure from partners. That things were complicated. That I should be patient. Patient while another woman slowly stepped into my place. Patient while my own husband allowed his family to erase me. The night I overheard them discussing my future, something inside me went cold. "She doesn't fit where we're going," my father-in-law said calmly. "She served her purpose," my mother-in-law replied. Lillian didn't say much. She didn't need to. Daniel said nothing. That was the moment I stopped trying to save my marriage. Because I finally understood the truth. They didn't want a wife for their son. They wanted a brand ambassador. And I was replaceable. What they didn't know was that while they were measuring my value, I was documenting everything. Contracts. Emails. Financial shortcuts. Unreported income. Illegal restructuring. I hadn't planned revenge. I had planned responsibility. And that would become their downfall. I packed my bags without drama. I left without accusations. I signed nothing. They thought they had won. They had no idea the real game hadn't even started. The weeks that followed my departure were quiet, but not empty. Daniel and his family assumed I would vanish from their lives. That I would retreat into grief or desperation. They assumed I had nothing without them. They assumed wrong. I spent the first few days sitting in my small apartment, surrounded by boxes, untouched documents, and a quiet that felt foreign. For the first time in years, there were no meetings, no demands, no forced smiles. Just me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. But my mind did not rest. I had built their systems. I had handled their numbers. I knew their weaknesses. I knew where the cracks in their empire ran. And now, it was time to act, not for revenge, but for justice. I hired a lawyer. One of the best, specializing in corporate law and family business disputes. I shared every file, every email, every irregularity. He looked at me once and said, "You are about to dismantle an empire." I smiled. I only want what's mine. And what's fair. Meanwhile, Daniel and Lillian continued their charade. They assumed my silence was weakness. They flaunted their engagement on social media. Posted photos of the office with Lillian smiling beside Daniel. And invited family friends to witness their perfect future. I watched from a distance. I observed every interaction, every error they made. Mistakes are the easiest enemy to fight. Within a month, my lawyer filed the papers, claims for unpaid labor, corporate mismanagement, wrongful termination, intellectual property violations, and undisclosed financial misconduct. The papers were delivered to the family home and the company office. Panic spread immediately. Daniel called me. His voice was sharp with panic, a mix of disbelief and anger. "Why are you doing this?" I answered simply, "You replaced me." I replaced silence with truth. They assumed I would fold under pressure. They assumed I would beg. They assumed I would retract my claims if threatened. I did nothing. The investigation began. Hidden accounts, forged invoices, manipulated taxes, all of it surfaced. Employees who had once been loyal to Daniel and his parents started talking. Investors who trusted the family suddenly demanded audits. Banks froze certain transactions. Suppliers requested immediate clarifications. Their empire, built on careful appearances and hidden errors, began crumbling. At first, I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. Not joy. Not malice. Just relief. Relief that truth was no longer mine alone to bear. Meanwhile, Lillian started noticing. Her confidence wavered. Invitations to corporate events were rescinded. Investors stopped returning calls. Daniel tried to shield her, but the cracks were too wide. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The law was doing its work, and truth moves faster than gossip or anger. At home, the family whispered constantly. My absence was a constant echo. My presence, once so physically removed, now haunted them legally. And each day, I felt the power of the tables turning. This was not revenge. This was consequence. They had replaced me because they wanted convenience, appearances, and control. They did not consider that I was intelligent, meticulous, and patient. The woman they thought powerless had already become their most formidable opponent. And this was only the beginning. The court hearings began quietly at first. But they quickly became the center of attention. Daniel and his family arrived with confidence, believing appearances would save them. Lillian walked beside him like she owned the courtroom, smiling at journalists who had already caught wind of the case. They underestimated the impact of evidence, and they underestimated me. When my lawyer began presenting the documents, the room shifted. Contracts I had drafted years ago. Emails showing manipulation. Records of unpaid work, all laid bare. Every claim was methodical, irrefutable, and precise. Daniel's face grew pale as the judge reviewed each document. He leaned toward his father, whispering urgently. But whispers are useless when truth is louder than ego. I watched quietly from my seat, calm, composed. Not a shred of anger escaped me. I had nothing to prove to them except one thing. Justice is inevitable when preparation meets patience. Lillian tried to interject during one session, her voice sharp. "These claims are exaggerated," she said. My lawyer stopped and looked at her. "Everything here is documented. Exaggeration is impossible when the evidence speaks for itself." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even Daniel's attorneys exchanged glances. They knew they had underestimated me. As the days passed, the pressure intensified. Banks froze certain accounts. Suppliers demanded immediate clarification. Employees who once hesitated to speak against the family business began testifying, confirming discrepancies and mismanagement. Daniel called me privately one evening, pleading. "We can settle this," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't destroy the family." I looked at him calmly. "You destroyed me quietly. I am merely returning the truth loudly." Each court session revealed more. Hidden accounts. Altered invoices. Mismanaged funds. Tax violations. The family empire that had seemed untouchable was unraveling piece by piece. By the third week, the courtroom was no longer just a legal arena, it was a stage. Everyone in attendance understood that this was more than a lawsuit. It was a moral reckoning. Lillian avoided eye contact. Daniel's parents whispered furiously. Their confidence was gone. The same people who had once controlled every meeting, every decision, every narrative in their company, were now powerless. When the judge called for the first testimony from an independent auditor, the finality of their situation hit them. Every hidden mistake, every corner cut to save money or maintain appearances, had been recorded. Every deception was exposed. I realized something at that moment: they had never really understood me. They had assumed that because I was quiet, diligent, and loyal, I would never act. But they had never measured patience as a weapon, and truth as the sharpest edge of all. I didn't feel joy. I felt control. Not over them, but over my own story. The first round of hearings ended with a clear outcome. The family business was suspended from certain operations pending investigation. Their reputation was publicly questioned. Legal obligations required immediate financial audits and accountability. Daniel's call to me that night was silent at first. Then, "I didn't know you could be this ruthless," he admitted. I didn't respond. Ruthless wasn't the right word. Precise. Methodical. Justified. And that night, I slept for the first time in months without dread or anxiety. The following weeks were a whirlwind of tension. And the atmosphere around Daniel's family had become unbearable. Their home, once a sanctuary of control and confidence, now felt like a gilded cage. Every glance from employees, every phone call from auditors, reminded them that their empire was no longer untouchable. And they knew why. I received the first direct communication from Lillian one morning. It was a carefully worded email, polite yet desperate. "Can we talk? I want to understand why this is happening. I don't want conflict." I read it once, smiled faintly, and responded with one line. "This is not about you. It is about accountability." She didn't reply. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings escalated. The court hearings were no longer just about financial mismanagement, they had become a battle of psychology. Daniel and his family realized that they had underestimated my resolve, my intelligence, and my capacity to remain calm under scrutiny. Every lawyer they consulted confirmed the same: the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel's mother cornered him one night. "You need to fix this," she demanded. "Call her. Apologize. Settle." He shook his head, panic flickering in his eyes. "No apology can undo this. It's not personal, it's proof. She has us by the facts, and she isn't going to release them." I was aware of every conversation. My lawyer had strategically leaked some updates to the press, ensuring that the public knew the severity of the case without compromising the legal process. The subtle pressure made the family more paranoid, more unstable, and more desperate. Then came the first personal confrontation. Daniel appeared at my office, not with anger, but with vulnerability. His usually confident posture was hunched. He spoke in measured tones, careful not to lose control. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. What did I ever do to deserve this humiliation? I looked at him without flinching. Humiliation. You replaced me. You erased me. You allowed your parents to decide I wasn't worthy. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice. He swallowed hard. But we were family. Family. I echoed. Family doesn't replace one of its own quietly. Without discussion, without respect. Family doesn't pretend loyalty while erasing someone's contribution. That is not family. That is convenience. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No words could undo what had already been set in motion. Weeks passed. Lillian withdrew from public appearances. Daniel's confidence waned, visible even to the employees who once feared him. The family began internally fracturing. Arguments over legal strategy, fear of media attention, and distrust of their own team created chaos. And through it all, I remained calm. Composed. I had nothing to prove to anyone except that truth, when wielded patiently and wisely, is stronger than anger or manipulation. Then, a turning point occurred in court. A former employee, someone Daniel had trusted implicitly, testified about the financial manipulations and misreporting that had occurred for years. Each word cut like a blade. Each revelation exposed another layer of their carefully constructed facade. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward, absorbing the weight of each fact. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not for destruction, but for justice. And as the hearing ended for the day, I realized something. The people who had thought they controlled everything were now powerless. The very structures they had built to secure their legacy were collapsing under the truth they had ignored. The aftermath of the courtroom revelations was immediate and brutal. Daniel's family had underestimated the power of truth. And now they were paying the price. Their company, once respected in the regional business community, was under public scrutiny. Investors withdrew support. Suppliers demanded payments they hadn't received. And the media began reporting on the lawsuit. Headlines circulated quickly. Family business in legal turmoil. Ex-wife uncovers corporate misconduct. Lillian, who had once appeared confident and untouchable, began to vanish from social events. Her polished image crumbled as she realized that appearances mean nothing when accountability is demanded. She sent polite messages to me, pleading for mediation, for a chance to fix things quietly. I ignored them. This was not about politeness. This was about justice. Daniel called me late one night. His voice was low, almost trembling. You don't have to destroy everything, he said. We could have resolved this privately. I looked at him calmly. Destroy? No. Reveal. Correct. Nothing more, nothing less. The company began to collapse under the weight of its own mismanagement. Employees who had once obeyed without question began to leave. Not out of rebellion, but because they could see the cracks and feared being implicated. Bank accounts were frozen as auditors demanded explanations. Contracts with clients were canceled due to mistrust. And through it all, I remained consistent, composed, and deliberate. The most powerful moment came when Daniel's father, the man who had orchestrated my replacement, realized that his authority had evaporated. He tried to call in favors, to bend people to his will, but every attempt failed. The foundation of the business was rotten. And no influence could rebuild what truth had exposed. One afternoon, I received a call from an independent consultant. The business is falling apart faster than expected, he said. We've never seen such immediate fallout from a single ex-employee filing claims. I allowed myself a small smile. Not of joy at their pain, but of satisfaction that honesty and preparation had worked. Meanwhile, Daniel began contacting former employees, trying to salvage relationships. But the damage was permanent. Contracts that had been forged or mismanaged could not be undone. Suppliers would no longer trust them. Investors had been alerted. The public now knew the story. At home, the tension was suffocating. Arguments broke out constantly. Daniel and Lillian fought silently but fiercely. His parents bickered over strategy, blame, and who had failed. Every discussion ended with frustration and fear. I knew this moment would arrive. They had assumed silence meant weakness. Patience meant submission, and loyalty meant obedience. They had not accounted for preparation, documentation, and the power of methodical action. And as the business crumbled around them, one thing became clear: their family, their empire, their sense of control, all had been illusions. Meanwhile, my life began to change. Freed from the environment that had constrained me, I focused on rebuilding my career on my own terms. I offered consulting to small businesses and entrepreneurs, guiding them ethically and strategically. My reputation grew. My confidence soared. By the end of the month, Daniel's family faced not just legal consequences, but social ones. Friends distanced themselves. Associates lost trust. Their better life they had envisioned was unraveling, piece by piece. And I stood quietly in my apartment, knowing that I had not sought revenge. I had simply restored balance. The final phase of the legal battle arrived with a weight that no one could ignore. What had started as a quiet lawsuit had now grown into a full public reckoning. The courtroom was packed: journalists, observers, former employees, and legal analysts filled every seat. Everyone knew this was the moment when everything would either collapse completely or be permanently sealed. Daniel sat rigid beside his lawyers, his face drained of color. Lillian avoided eye contact with anyone, staring straight ahead as if the walls themselves might protect her. His parents whispered nervously, no longer the confident figures they once were. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The final evidence was presented slowly, deliberately. Financial experts explained discrepancies that could no longer be dismissed as mistakes. Auditors confirmed long-term manipulation of records. Former partners testified about being pressured into silence. Every statement was calm, factual, and devastating. Daniel's legal team attempted damage control, but it was futile. Each defense collapsed under cross-examination. The judge asked pointed questions, questions that demanded honesty, not excuses. Then came the moment no one expected. Daniel was called to testify. He stood, adjusting his jacket with shaking hands, and walked to the stand. The confident businessman, the man who had once believed he could replace people like objects, now looked fragile. Under oath, he struggled to answer basic questions. Dates blurred. Decisions contradicted previous statements. At one point, he paused, his voice cracking as he realized there was no version of the truth that could save him. The courtroom watched as the illusion finally shattered. When my lawyer asked him why my name had been removed from contracts and records, despite my contributions, Daniel hesitated too long. The silence was louder than any confession. I thought it would be easier, he finally admitted. That single sentence changed everything. Easier to erase me. Easier to replace me. Easier to pretend loyalty had no value. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, and took notes. When Lillian was called, her confidence dissolved entirely. She spoke defensively, attempting to distance herself from decisions she had once proudly supported. But the evidence contradicted her at every turn. Emails, messages, witness statements. By the end of the day, it was clear to everyone in the room, this was no longer a debate. It was a conclusion waiting to be announced. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed. Reporters crowded Daniel and his family, asking questions they could no longer control. They said nothing. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I sat alone, reflecting on how far this had gone. I felt no triumph, only closure approaching. The anger that once lived inside me had been replaced by something calmer and stronger. Self-respect. The next morning, the judge delivered a preliminary ruling. The family business was found liable for multiple violations. Operations were suspended indefinitely. Financial restitution was ordered. Further investigations were mandated. Daniel lowered his head. His parents stared forward, stunned. Lillian's hands trembled as she gripped her chair. And in that moment, the truth became unavoidable: they had not lost because of me. They had lost because of what they chose to do when they thought no one was watching. As the court adjourned, I walked out quietly, unnoticed by most. I didn't need attention. Justice had already spoken. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end. Because sometimes, the most powerful consequences come after the verdict, when people are forced to live with the reality they created. The days after the court's decision were quieter on the surface. But underneath, everything had changed. The family that once thrived on control, image, and authority now lived in the shadow of their own choices. The business headquarters stood half empty. Its once busy halls silent except for the echoes of footsteps and unresolved regret. Daniel stopped calling. Lillian disappeared entirely from public view. His parents retreated into isolation. Their influence gone, their confidence shattered. The world they had built around power and appearances had collapsed. And there was no one left to blame but themselves. I, on the other hand, began to experience something unfamiliar: peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoidance, but the steady calm of knowing I had stood up for myself without becoming cruel. Opportunities opened up unexpectedly. Former colleagues reached out, expressing admiration for my courage. Small business owners sought my guidance. Not just for strategy, but for ethical leadership. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Daniel. He wrote about regret, real regret this time, not the convenient kind. He admitted that replacing me had been a decision driven by ego and fear, not logic. He confessed that he had allowed his family to dictate his choices, believing success required obedience rather than integrity. I lost everything because I didn't value the right things, he wrote. I read the letter carefully, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, I realized, does not always require reconciliation. Some apologies are acknowledged silently, without reopening doors that were closed for a reason. Public opinion slowly shifted. What had once been gossip became a cautionary tale discussed in business circles. Legal analysts reference the case as an example of how internal arrogance can destroy even the strongest organizations. Employees who once feared retaliation spoke openly about toxic workplace culture and the cost of silence. Meanwhile, I built something new. Not a replacement for what I lost, but something better. A consultancy grounded in transparency, fairness, and respect. I hired people based on merit, not connections. I listened more than I commanded. And for the first time, success felt clean. There was one final encounter I didn't expect. Months later, I ran into Lillian at a quiet cafe. She looked different, less polished, more human. Our eyes met briefly. She hesitated, then nodded. I never thought it would end like this, she said softly. Neither did I replied. That was all. No anger. No confrontation. Just the shared understanding that choices have consequences. And not all lessons come gently. As I walked away, I felt lighter. Not because I had won, but because I no longer carried the weight of being underestimated. And I knew the final chapter wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. About dignity reclaimed. About power redefined. And about the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth, long after others failed to see it. The final chapter arrived not with noise, but with clarity. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt honest, earned, and steady. The chaos, the courtrooms, the whispers, all of it now felt distant. Like a storm that had passed but left the air cleaner than before. I often reflected on how easily my life had been dismissed, replaced, rewritten by people who believed they had the right to decide my value. They had thought strength came from control, from dominance, from appearances. They were wrong. Strength, I learned, comes from patience paired with action. From silence paired with preparation. My work flourished, not because I sought revenge, but because I built something rooted in integrity. Clients trusted me because I refused shortcuts. Employees respected me because I treated them as partners, not tools. Every success carried a quiet reminder of where I had come from. And why I would never compromise myself again. Occasionally, I would hear updates about Daniel's family. Attempts to restart the business failed. Lawsuits lingered. Relationships fractured beyond repair. Their world had not ended in a single dramatic moment, it dissolved slowly. The way all unsustainable things do. And yet, I felt no satisfaction in their downfall. Only understanding. They had believed replacing a person was easy. They had believed silence meant weakness. They had believed power protected them from consequence. They were wrong on every count. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on, I realized something profound. I had never been replaced. I had been released. Released from a life where I was undervalued, unheard, and unseen. The lawsuit did not define me. The betrayal did not break me. The humiliation they planned became the foundation of my freedom. If there was a lesson in all of this, it was simple and universal. Never underestimate someone who chooses dignity over drama, preparation over reaction, and truth over fear. Because when people try to erase you, and you respond by standing firmly in who you are, you don't just survive, you redefine the outcome. And in the end, that was the real victory.